There are houses that keep their history alive through photographs, family heirlooms, or creaking floorboards. And then there are houses like the Durnham estate, homes that refuse to forget. In 2025, a restoration team in rural Massachusetts thought they were reviving a piece of forgotten architecture. What they unearthed instead was a secret sealed behind plaster and time itself, one that had been waiting for 93 years. It started when a worker's hammer struck through an unusually thick wall, releasing a smell of decay, rot, and something metallic, something old. Inside the cavity they found a child's toy, a decayed ribbon, and a leather-bound journal so brittle it crumbled at touch. The first page read, "They told me never to write about the noises, but now they're inside the walls." The Durnham family, once the town's pride, had simply vanished from history after 1932. No death records, no graves, no sale of the property, just disappearance, as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Locals whispered that the house was cursed, that it breathed at night, and that the walls wept when the air turned cold. But what no one realized was that the Durnhams had left something, someone, inside those walls, something that never wanted to be found. And when the plaster cracked open, it wasn't just dust and darkness that escaped. It was a secret, one that the Durnham family buried alive. The discovery began on a cold morning in March, when the demolition crew arrived at the Durnham property expecting little more than the usual rot and decay of a century-old home. The mansion stood like a wounded relic on the edge of the Massachusetts woodlands, its gables warped, its windows veiled with grime, and its walls marked with deep, unsettling cracks that seemed almost deliberate, as if something inside had been pushing to get out. The crew had been hired to clear the structure for restoration, a project funded by an anonymous investor who claimed the Durnham estate deserved to breathe again. None of the workers knew the house's history, nor the whispers that surrounded it. To them, it was just another job, until the sound came. The first strike of the sledgehammer against the parlor wall should have echoed hollow, but instead it rang dense and muted, the kind of sound you get when striking something thick, sealed, and full. The foreman frowned, signaling for the team to pause, and pressed his ear against the wallpaper. Beneath the faded pattern of roses, he heard it, a faint rattle, followed by a soft thump. He brushed it off as falling debris and instructed the men to keep going. But when the wall split, what came spilling out was not insulation or dust. It was air, stale, heavy, and strangely cold, like the exhale of a crypt that had been sealed too long. As the workers chipped away at the plaster, they uncovered an odd cavity, no more than 2 feet deep, filled with what looked like a pile of forgotten objects. There was an old porcelain doll with a cracked face, its glass eyes filmed over in a milky glaze. There were tiny leather shoes, their laces fused together by time, and a child's hair ribbon faded to the color of dried blood. But what drew everyone's attention was the book wedged tightly between the studs, a small leather journal, warped and blackened at the edges. Its pages were fragile, stiff with age, and the ink had bled into the parchment like veins. The foreman turned it over carefully and noticed something carved faintly into the cover. AD followed by the year 1932. One of the younger workers, curious and uneasy, muttered that it must have belonged to one of the Durnham children. Another joked nervously that maybe the walls didn't want to be opened. When they pried the rest of the section apart, they realized the cavity wasn't random. It had been deliberately built into the structure, sealed with multiple layers of plaster and lath. The hammer marks around the edges weren't from time or damage. They were from someone desperately trying to close it off from the inside. The workers fell silent as they stood before it, a mixture of awe and dread creeping through them. The room's temperature seemed to drop. One of them swore he heard a faint knocking behind the remaining section of the wall, but when they listened again, there was only stillness. It took hours before anyone dared to open the journal, but when they finally did, the first line sent a chill through the crew. They told me never to write about the noises, but now they're inside the walls. From that moment, the atmosphere shifted. The lights flickered as if the power itself recoiled from the discovery, and a deep unease settled over the house. The team packed up early that day, shaken and reluctant to continue. Later, when they tried to document what they had found, the photos came out distorted, blurry streaks running through the images like shadows in motion. They didn't know it then. But the wall they had opened wasn't just hiding the past. It was protecting the present from something much darker, something that had been waiting for 93 years to be disturbed. The journal, though fragile and half-decayed, became the only surviving voice of the Durnham family's final days, written in a trembling childlike hand that belonged to Abigail Durnham, the youngest of the 4 children. Each entry revealed fragments of a growing terror that unfolded within the house during the winter of 1932. Her words carried the innocent tone of a child trying to understand things that no child ever should. The first few pages seemed harmless enough. Mentions of her father's long hours in the cellar, her mother's sudden quietness, her siblings whispering about the promise, and the strange new locks her father had installed on the attic door. But soon, the tone shifted from playful curiosity to fear disguised as obedience. Abigail began writing about the noises in the walls, sounds that began softly like scratching, then grew louder with each passing night. She described how her sister Clara claimed to see faces in the wallpaper, how her brother Samuel swore he heard someone whispering his name from inside the vents, and how their parents dismissed it all as imagination, until the sounds began to mimic voices they knew. Abigail's writing grew more frantic the deeper one read, her words descending into the kind of terror that doesn't come from a child's fantasy, but from something lived, something endured. She wrote that the walls breathed after midnight, expanding and contracting as if they were alive, and how the smell of damp earth filled her room when the house fell silent. Her mother, once gentle and loving, started burning sage and muttering prayers she never used to say, while her father stopped sleeping altogether, spending nights behind the basement door, hammering, whispering, and crying. Abigail mentioned finding him once at dawn, his hands trembling, his clothes streaked with red dust, warning her never to go near the walls again. One line in particular stood out, smeared as though written through tears. "Father says we made a promise to the house and now it wants us to keep it." The entries became erratic, some scrawled sideways, others written over previous pages as if she was running out of time. She described hearing her sister's laughter echoing from the walls after Clara had already disappeared. She said her mother started sleeping in the hallway with her ear pressed to the plaster, whispering, "They're still here, I can hear them breathe." Her father's handwriting appeared only once, a single warning written at the bottom of a page. "Do not open what I have sealed." The last few entries turned nearly illegible, ink blotted, words cut off mid-sentence, as if she had been interrupted. The final readable line sent shivers through the restoration team. They said if we keep the promise, the house will let us stay. But it's hungry now. When investigators later analyzed the journal, they confirmed the ink and paper dated back to the 1930s. But what disturbed them most were the impressions on the back pages, indentations that suggested she had kept writing even when no ink was left, as though desperate to get something out before it was too late. The last few pages were fused together, melted as if exposed to heat or moisture, yet faint shapes could be seen between them, tiny prints that looked eerily like fingertips pressing from the other side. The restoration team that discovered it never returned to the property after reading the journal in full. Those who did claimed that at night, when the wind passed through the broken windows, the house made a low, rhythmic sound like breathing, trapped between the walls, as if the Durnham's promise still lingered, echoing through the hollow bones of the home that refused to let them go. The town of Durnham. Hollow had always been small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and nothing ever stayed secret for long. Yet somehow the disappearance of the Durnham children slipped quietly through history as though erased by an unseen hand. When the restoration team's findings made local news, the town historian, a frail woman named Mrs. Ellery, brought forward an unsettling revelation. She had once seen mention of the Durnham children in early census records, But when she tried to find those files again, they were gone. What she uncovered instead were fragments, faded newspaper clippings, a missing person notice without photos, and a police log that abruptly ended mid-investigation. 3 children, Clara, Samuel, and Abigail Durnham, were reported missing in December 1932, but by January, every trace of the report had vanished from official archives. There was no follow-up, no memorial service, and no record of any search beyond a single week. It was as though the town had collectively agreed to forget. Neighbors from that era, or at least the few still alive to remember, spoke reluctantly when asked about the family. One man, then a boy of 10, recalled hearing screams late at night followed by a sound like wood being nailed shut. Another said his father forbade him from going near the estate, claiming the Durnhams had locked their sin inside. There were whispers of strange rituals, of the father's obsession with old texts brought back from Europe after the war, and of lights flickering in the windows long after the house was declared abandoned. Yet, every time someone tried to report what they saw, the sheriff's office brushed it off as hysteria. One deputy who handled the original investigation left town soon after, telling friends that the case had been closed by something higher than the law. His notebook, found decades later, contained a single chilling line on the final page. The walls weren't built to keep people out. They were built to keep something in. When modern researchers dug deeper, they found the town's public records from 1932 suspiciously incomplete. Entire weeks of documentation were missing, replaced with new pages written in a different hand, all signed by the same county clerk who reportedly died the following year. Even more disturbing, property records listed the Durnham estate as uninhabited since 1918, despite photographs proving the family lived there well into the 1930s. Some began to suspect deliberate erasure, perhaps ordered by someone who knew what really happened inside that house. Local folklore suggested that the Durnhams made a pact with something that dwelled in the Home S Foundation, a keeper that offered wealth and protection in exchange for silence. But when that silence was broken, so were the Durnhams. Over the years, a handful of explorers and amateur historians claimed to have found remnants of that lost investigation. One uncovered a police badge fused to what looked like melted plaster inside the basement, as if heat had warped the walls from within. Another found a sealed envelope in the county archives labeled "Incident at Durnham Residence," but before it could be opened, the envelope disappeared. It became a running theme. Any documentation, photo, or object connected to the family's final days simply vanished, as if the house itself extended its reach to protect the secret it harbored. Even digital records suffered corruption. Files containing references to the Durnhams glitched or refused to open. What remained were only oral accounts, fragmented memories from descendants of those who once lived nearby. They spoke of the smell of burning wood that never came from a fire, of children's laughter echoing from the woods at night, and of the faint sound of tapping, 3 soft knocks, on the walls of their own homes whenever the Durnham name was spoken aloud. The more people tried to resurrect the truth, the more that truth seemed to bury itself deeper, like the house was still obeying an old command to hide what happened. And so, the disappearance of the Durnham children became less of a mystery and more of a warning, a lingering reminder that some tragedies are not forgotten. They are erased because something in them refuses to be remembered. The discovery of the Durnham estate's original blueprints came from a county archivist who had been combing through forgotten property records to confirm the mansion's age. The house had always been an architectural oddity, but the blueprints revealed something far more sinister than eccentric design, a hidden room intentionally omitted from every public record and every renovation permit filed after 1932. The official blueprints were clean, symmetrical, and grand, reflecting the Durnhams' wealth and status. Yet beneath a stack of dust-covered documents, the archivist found an earlier version, one marked in the hand of the original architect, Nathaniel Wexler. His signature appeared at the corner beside a faint red stain, perhaps ink, perhaps something else. In that set of plans, a small square space sat behind the eastern wall of the parlor, connected by narrow voids that traced through the inner structure like veins. That space had no doors, no windows, and no reason to exist. It was, by all appearances, a sealed chamber built deliberately and concealed with precision. When the restoration team compared this hidden layout to the existing structure, their findings aligned disturbingly well. The measurements of the mysterious cavity they had broken open matched the hidden room's exact proportions. They realized the wall they had struck was not just random plaster. It was part of a much larger design, one meant to mislead anyone who tried to read the house's true anatomy. The more they studied, the clearer it became that the Durnhams had commissioned Wexler to design a home that obeyed different rules, one where walls overlapped and corridors dead-ended into silence. Wexler himself had been known for his obsession with sacred geometry, the belief that architectural symmetry could summon or contain spiritual forces. Historians later noted that he vanished under mysterious circumstances in 1933, just months after completing the Durnham project. Some speculated he had gone mad, claiming the house he built was alive and breathing through its design. The blueprints also revealed notes scrawled in the margins in faded pencil. One read, "Chamber must remain sealed. Do not install venting. Do not revisit." Another said, "Request from client. Space for the promise." It was an odd phrase, one that matched the language found in Abigail's journal, suggesting the Durnhams, and Wexler had worked together to construct this hidden area for a purpose no one could yet explain. Even stranger were the angles within the chamber's geometry. They didn't conform to standard architectural norms. The walls inside, if ever built as drawn, would create a continuous echo chamber. Sound would enter, but never escape. When the restoration crew tried to physically locate the chamber within the house, they found evidence of deliberate tampering. Layers of false plaster and secondary beams had been added decades later, perhaps to reinforce the seal. In one section of the basement foundation, a faint seam ran along the wall, almost invisible but undeniably man-made. Tapping on it produced a hollow sound that seemed to shift in tone, as though something inside was reacting to the noise. One of the crew members claimed that after striking the wall 3 times, he heard the faint echo of a 4th knock coming from the other side. The crew decided not to test it again. Engineers who later examined the plans under infrared light discovered faint sketches of what appeared to be symbols, circles within circles, drawn along the edges of the hidden space. They resembled ritual sigils rather than structural markings. In the lower corner of the page, the architect had written a final note, barely legible through time. "The family insists it must remain within. If it wakes, none will rest." Whatever "it" referred to, the Durnhams went to extreme lengths to hide it, not by locking it in a room, but by building the entire house around it, as though the mansion itself was meant to be a coffin. The revelation of that missing chamber turned the Durnham estate from a relic of wealth into something far more disturbing. A design born not of ambition, but containment, where every beam and nail existed to keep something unseen sealed in darkness, whispering softly through the walls it called home. When the restoration crew finally breached the last sealed wall, what they unleashed went far beyond a simple architectural anomaly. It was as if the house itself had been waiting for that moment, holding its breath for nearly a century before exhaling something old and unspeakably wrong. The moment the final section of plaster fell, a deep, hollow groan echoed through the empty halls, the kind of sound that doesn't come from the structure settling, but from something alive responding. Inside, they expected to find the hidden chamber described in the blueprints, but what they found was far stranger. A narrow, vertical space, lined with rotting wood, and a dark residue that clung to the walls like dried blood. The air was dense and humid, heavy with the scent of iron and decay, as if time had curdled there. At the bottom of the cavity lay remnants of old cloth, bone fragments, and what looked like a child's handprint smeared into the wood. One of the workers swore he heard breathing, faint but rhythmic, coming from somewhere deeper inside. Though when they shone their flashlights, the beams seemed to bend, disappearing into an impossible blackness that swallowed the light whole. Within hours of that discovery, the atmosphere of the house began to change. Tools went missing, lights flickered, and the air grew colder, carrying with it the faint scent of burnt hair and something sweet, something that didn't belong in the dust of an abandoned home. Workers reported hearing whispering just beyond their range of vision, soft, coaxing voices that seemed to know their names. The foreman, a man not easily shaken, quit the project after waking to find fresh plaster dust on his pillow and long, thin scratches running across the wall above his bed in his own handwriting. Let it sleep. Security cameras later installed to monitor the site recorded distorted footage, frames twisting and warping as though the walls themselves were shifting. In several clips, faint outlines appeared in the plaster, shapes of faces pressing outward as if struggling to breathe. Those who stayed longer began to experience hallucinations, though each described them differently. One saw children standing in the corners, eyes hollow, mouths moving soundlessly. Another said he felt a pulse under the floorboards, like the rhythm of a buried heartbeat. But the most disturbing account came from a preservation specialist who returned alone one evening to collect samples from the sealed chamber. He reported hearing a faint lullaby coming from inside the wall, followed by the unmistakable sound of a child's voice whispering, "It's hungry again." The man ran from the house and never returned, abandoning his car by the gate. It was later found empty, its radio softly playing static, the driver's seat covered in fine white dust, as though he had simply dissolved. As news spread, the site drew attention from paranormal investigators and historians alike, each attempting to uncover what the Durnhams had imprisoned. Some claimed the family Essie promise was a binding ritual meant to contain a spirit born of blood and guilt, something that fed on silence and isolation. Others believed it was no spirit at all, but the physical manifestation of the family's sins, a consciousness formed by generations of secrets walled away. Whatever it was, once disturbed, it began to move again. Workers who returned to patch the damage reported the plaster refusing to set, as if the walls rejected being closed. The final sign came when the house's foundation began to vibrate at night, a low, steady hum that made the glass tremble and the floor quiver beneath their feet, and in the reflection of the cracked windows, some swore they saw the faint silhouettes of 3 children standing just beyond the threshold, waiting for the house to breathe once more. So if you want to know what they found next, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.